Okay, thank you so much, Nadia. I appreciate that. And thank you for the accommodation today. I really do appreciate it. So, as Nadia said, today we're going to talk about looking at Indigenous learners in just a little bit of a different framework, but really looking at them as EAL. And it started one of the first classes, and Nadia had said something, and it just kind of stuck there for quite some time for me about how, and I'd never personally had thought about EAL learners being Indigenous learners. So that's what we're going to cover today. So to begin, I'm just going to welcome you, Waituk, which is in my language, welcome. It actually means welcome everyone. And we're going to start this in a really good way. And so a couple of things I want to let you know is we're going to talk about some subjects that sometimes people might not be a little bit comfortable with. But my goal today is to actually make you comfortably uncomfortable. So it's not anything that you're going to get mad, I hope, and walk out. But certainly it is something maybe not as easy to discuss some of the things. And then today, I really would like you to just kind of listen, and because that's a really good Indigenous learning pedagogy. And there will be time for reflection as well. And if you'd like a copy of this presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm more than willing to discuss this anytime. So, some of our things that we're going to talk about today is trying to get all these, apologize, is that we're going to identify how colonialism and really bias impact Indigenous learners and their success. We're going to talk about the importance of recognizing Indigenous languages, including dialects of English, and also how we could use English as an additional language strategies to empower the learners in our schools. So the first thing I want to talk about is isn't this word colonialism, and we hear it quite often. And sometimes people like to think about this as being something that was in the past, but colonialism still really exists. And so in 1867, Canada, we know, became its own country and it was no longer a colony of Britain. And so even it's been that long, our system of governance really remains rooted in the ideas of colonialism. And so if we look at what colonialism really is, colonialism occurs when there's a group of people who exert political or economic dominance over another group. And right now it's interesting because it seems to be what's some people are trying to do as we hear in the news. And so worldwide, Indigenous people have been subjected to these forms of dominance by European settlers. And so in Canada, the government's creation of the Indian Act in 1876 really defined how inequitable that relationship with Indigenous people would be. And so, as you can see here, the quote by Life, there are many factors that contribute to this inequity. And these factors not only include colonialism and poverty, but those effects of residential schools, including intergenerational trauma, and also, until recently, there's been a really failure to promote literacy in a culturally appropriate context using traditional languages. It's starting, but we really have limited supplies, I guess, or examples. So we'll briefly touch on residential schools and what the impact that had on language. And so part of, as we know, residential schools was they had a mandate to assimilate the Indigenous population. And a major part of that assimilation was through language. And as Epstein stated, that learning the English was actually really subtractive for Aboriginal and Métis people and other languages. And so what the hope was is that English would replace those traditional languages. And we know that that really happened because many of survivors of residential schools, it's very rare for them to be bilingual. And so the education of Aboriginal people really during this time and during like if we want to think about it as colonialism, really is a major contributor to the major loss of Aboriginal speakers. So For myself, from where my family is from, which is Kamloops First Nation, I'll use the English term so you have an idea where that is. Um, on our reserve, we only have 3% of our population that are fluent speakers. And so that is quite devastating to a culture. We'll talk about that later. But this certainly does give challenges to keeping culture and identity if you don't have your language. And so the last residential school we know closed in 1996, but the way that we currently do education continues to be a huge barrier for Indigenous learners. And according to Chandler and Weiberg, white norms are a reoccurring pattern of behavior that we see that benefit white people. And so the education system is often based on those norms of whiteness and that they don't really work for many of our diverse students. And it's not just Indigenous students that this happens. And so, unfortunately, our education system is still has its basis in colonial time, like in Victorian time. There's many of our practices that we do that are still there. And I know that we're changing and we are evolving. But that because it's so based in those white norms, it really creates a lot of achievement gaps between our non-white students and our white students. And there's much research that actually follows this. So this is a picture of a U of S class that I pulled up off of the internet, and you can see it's pretty white. And so when we start looking at our post-secondary classrooms, they tend to be dominant white norms. So when a system is rooted is only in the norms of one group, and specifically sometimes we're looking at like a colonized nation, there really becomes a creation of a power dynamic, and that has real negative connotations or consequences for learners. So a number of researchers, including Epstein, Heinrichs, and Cummings and Prasad, recognize that the current Eurocentric model of education actually creates quite a bit of oppression for non-English speaking individuals. And as they stated in their Heinrich states in their paper, the decolonial turn in language education has further seen calls for rethinking of school systems where the medium of instruction, for example, English, still exerts oppressive control over Indigenous and minority students and their language. So the fact that we only have English in the majority of our norm schools, that actually causes oppression. So this imbalance of power creates a disconnect for our Indigenous learners, and they don't really see themselves within the system, and they're often unsuccessful in achieving those educational milestones that we want. Now, a big part of that is because of disengagement. And so a lot of our First Nations and Métis people really become, at least as learners, feel or are invisible. And this statement was along the lines from Ladson and Billing, and they coined the phrase academic death. And so when that happens, when there's like a dehumanization of knowledge present in classrooms, and that ends up with disengagement and academic failure for culturally diverse students. So educational stakeholders are beginning to recognize and address a lot of these barriers for our different educational success for our Indigenous learners. And we can trace the evolution of Canadian educational policies and practice in relation to linguistic diversity from explicitly racist focus on getting rid of diverse languages and cultures in the 1960s to what we have today, where we're starting to see a more of an emergence of like a pedagogical orientation that we term through teaching with that multilingual lens. So I'm hoping this video works. So just give me a moment.
Fortunately, the audio is not coming through on this one. I wonder if you optimized your audio prior to starting. I'm not hearing you as well.
Uh, okay. Okay. Sorry.
We're there.
Yep. Maybe I'll just put them, I don't know, the mic being closer.
Try it.
Yeah,
Try
we'll
the,
try it. Just give me one
if you can
moment.
hear it on your
I
side.
could, yeah.
Yeah. So if
Or
you want to try your mic and see how that works.
you know what?
And
It's
then,
but it's going through my headphones. So maybe what we will do since it doesn't want to. Oh, I wonder if my headphones will try this to start with.
for the recording, we'll splice this piece and put in the
Are you
video
able to
clip.
hear it now? Morning.
Yes. Yes.
How are you?
Turn it up if you can.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
Good. Thanks.
Yeah, you think I got a funny looking face? Hey kids, I'm turning back right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Boy, right here before I'm cooked out.
So, you didn't do anything? Nope. Then what's all this? Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home. He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm going to have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told them Tris was gonna put you in the hospital.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him. Hi.
It ain't fair. Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
But you just like everybody else. You say you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop.
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. Yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. Sorry. I'm so sorry.
Okay, there we go. So there's a reason I wanted to show this video. And really what I would like you to do is, if you are comfortable with doing it, with an elbow partner for just a minute or two, just I'd like you to talk about how this video actually applies in a Canadian context. This is an American video, but I think it's actually quite kind of points out a few things. So I'll just give you a moment to talk with an elbow partner about why I maybe chose this video, or at least how that applies to our context that we are in here in Canada. So I'll give you a moment to talk.
And in the meantime, Penny, would you like me to provide your handouts?
Oh, yeah, if you have them there.
We
yes,
just
thank you.
printed them. Yep.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good.
And if anyone wants some extra ones, I've got 50 copies here in my office. So. Okay, well, I'll just ask you to wrap up your conversations here in a moment, and we will continue. So about 10 more seconds, and then we'll start again.
You may have to create a big bonfire with the extra copies or hand them out to your teachers.
I think it might be something I get to do later on. All right, we'll continue our conversation. So there's not a lot of research. There's starting to become some research about EAL learners, Indigenous learners here in Canada. But a lot of the work has been done in Australia and in New Zealand. And so Merger did quite a bit of work, and this is from one of the many papers that they wrote with different researchers. And they looked at some of the barriers for success for Aboriginal children in Australia. And they said one of the biggest things is there are biases, and that's kind of why I wanted to show that video. Is sometimes we may not acknowledge, and everybody has bias. Like, I do some work also in anti-racism education, and so everyone has biases, and those biases sometimes help us create misconceptions until we learn something different. And so those misconceptions and biases are is often influences that creation of policies and practices within our systems, even within our classrooms. And so, of course, the educational system is no different than any other system. And so, as I said, we've had lots of research from Australia and New Zealand. And so they said that a lot of the gaps of struggling learners, especially with Aboriginal children, that gap is widening. That's something that we see here in Saskatchewan as well. And so one of their papers talk about how that so many of these barriers that are listed here, they overlap. It's not just one thing. If it was just one thing for some of these learners, maybe we would have a chance, but it's multiple levels of these like intersectionality that happens and that cause some really difficult barriers for these learners. And so it might be that in Australia, they do use students as EAL learners. Of course, we know about absenteeism that happens sometimes for various reasons, some home factors, because they also had residential schools there, even their attitudes and their engagement. And there can be school factors and system factors. And as I said, they can be a number of things that kind of compact become more and more for these learners. But One of the things that I found the most interesting in this research is that the biggest factor to overcoming this barrier is actually lies with teachers, and that teachers actually provide often one of those barriers. And so often teachers will have some negative perceptions of these learners, and that a lot of the evidence gathered, and it includes information and research done here in Canada, is that number one, that there's a huge belief on teachers that there's just not enough time to be able to support the literacy learning of these struggling learners, and that they just don't have that time in the day. And so because of that, what happens is they are often forgotten. And so Babby, who is I believe a Canadian researcher, said that what ends up happening, because these kids are struggling, is that mainstream teachers, they don't end up having a very positive attitude towards these learners. And often they will relate those academic challenges that they have to that they're lazy, or they have a lack of effort, or they don't even understand some of the complicated life situations these learners are in. Now, we know that there's lots of complex and multifaceted reasons why Indigenous learners struggle. And so one of the things that I like to talk about, or that I do some work in, is assessment practices, because we know that they may be biased. And we've talked about that in our EAL classes. And they may not actually measure learning very well. And so when we look at those standardized tests that sometimes our Indigenous learners have to take, they may be impacted by differences in culture. It may be differences in their worldviews, because we know that Indigenous people, we all have different worldviews based on our place. So there's some similarities, but I don't want to paint everything with a pan-Indigenous or paintbrush. But sometimes it's just those different worldviews that collide with those Eurocentric understandings that cause problems. Sometimes that are people who are designing our assessments, they don't understand that there's different cognitive processing skills because of those cultural differences. And so when you have cultural and language differences, it makes it really difficult to meet expectations. And so that means that they're often unsuccessful. And then teachers become frustrated because there's a lack of progress or even engagement, because they're really unaware that there may be a language barrier that's there, compounded with differences in cultural practices and worldviews. And of course, our learners become quite frustrated as well. And so they know that they need to go to school, that you're not telling them something that they don't know, but they sometimes have too many barriers that they face to succeed. And after a while, it just becomes easier not to attend or not to engage in classrooms. And that brings us to our question is really, who is an EAL learner? And that's kind of where one of those barriers that they face. And so there's a lot of misconceptions with EAL teachers and maybe administrators, that an EAL student has to come from a different language, or they have to look something, and they often overlook some of our EAL learners that are actually born here in Canada. And so we know, or maybe some people don't know, that Aboriginal language is actually recognized as a dialect of English. And so although there's little research in Canada, this has been well documented in Australia and New Zealand. And so when we talk about dialects of English, it often creates this situation where people have this idea that there's a perception that their grammar is less than best, or there's something wrong with them. Because they're not fluent in the standard variety of English, they're at a social disadvantage. And so what ends up happening is they get pegged into this idea that they have low status or low intelligence, or that they're relatively incompetent in the school setting. And so Fadden and LaFrance stress how language-related challenges lead to perceived also behavioral challenges and deficit thinkings about the learner and their families. And so what happens is that a lot of times these Indigenous students end up being labeled behaviorally difficult, or that they have some kind of defective part of them, and that needs to be corrected. And so this negative method actually acknowledges that a young child's personal, family, and speech community is it's really unacceptable that that is thoughts that happen, but it does happen. And often that what happens, because the students are frustrated, they become put in behaviorally adapted classrooms. So an hour goes by really quickly with this, so I don't want to I just want to give you just a moment again to reflect, because reflection is an Indigenous pedagogy. So far, thinking, you can choose one of these. You don't have to think them all. In your own head, think right now, like, what connections are you starting to make about what we've learned so far and your own life? Or perhaps you want to think about, like, what ideas or positions or assumptions do you want to challenge or argue with me? That does happen. That's okay. That's as a learning strategy. What do you think are key concepts right now that you're trying to think about we've talked about? And what kind of changes in attitude, or maybe thinking, or even understandings maybe you've had a little bit of a light bulb moment. I'm not sure. So just give you a moment just to kind of think about those just for a quick moment.
I could, if I could ask a question just
Sure.
of the people in the room.
Yeah.
Sorry, my voice hasn't recovered from laryngitis, which I had a little while back. So the question that I have for you in the room, and this question will be cut out of our video recording because this is technically a pause. How many of you in your school situation have EAL learners who are also of Indigenous background? In your school division. So do you include the EAL learners? Do you include Indigenous students into EAL programs or EAL classes or EAL support? Or is that done separately somehow? So, okay. Okay. So just to reiterate for Penny, Megan Chan was saying that has a bit of an experimental approach this year, if I could call it that, or she has a project going where she's combining lower literacy, EAL learners, no, Indigenous learners with her EAL students in a sheltered class.
Oh, that's terrific.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So that's just a question I wanted to throw out there. It's been a question in my mind for many years because it hasn't been happening. Okay, I'm going to turn this back over to you, Penny.
Okay. All right. So there is a growing awareness that how Indigenous learners really are, maybe as English as an additional language learner, and so even though they've been traditionally overlooked and they haven't received any of the dedicated resources, services, or even any advocacy for themselves. And so we're finding that more and more now, as culture is being reborn, I guess. It's not reborn, but embraced by community. We're getting more and more English language learners. So I know in our division, we actually have a student that just came to one of our schools that is a fluent Dene speaker. That's what they speak in their home. That's their first language. And so we're going to have to start looking at these students as being English as additional language. And so in Manitoba, they're doing actually quite a bit of work, and they are starting to screen Indigenous children to see where they are. Are they English as an additional language learner or English as a dialect learner? And so they're starting to recognize there. So we are having some change, but it is slow change. So I wanted to include this because this is where the stumbling block that people get to about how well they speak English. And so I found this video and I hope this works as well. I'm going to unplug. And this one happens to be he's going to speak a little bit about using res language and just tell a story and how different that is from a language. Oh, sorry. Oh, no. Oh, it doesn't want to work. Okay, it does not want to work. So I apologize for that. All these things that you hope to work and they don't. They don't. Okay.
We'll include this in the video recording. We'll
okay.
Cut and paste it in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll get that for you. But this was a really good example. And he talks about using res slang as he calls it. He is actually an EAL teacher. And so he kind of looks at the idea that it's very, very different, some of the words that are used than in regular English. And that idea that it is a dialect that people do not say. And I'm going to tell you, depending on the place, the language is very different. The res language or I'm not going to call it res language because that's really derogatory, but oh, I wonder if maybe this will work. Just give me one moment. Just see it here. See if I can get here. Don't. There we go.
If you had any chunks, you say I had no more chunks left. So I said, well, I got some chip-ins. So we picked up some tall boys and started taking mains. One boy said, let's go check out this party. So I said, all right then. So I went over there. One of these homeboys was there, man. Chris been J me. Chris been J, your dad, all this time. So he wanted to throw hands. So I had to put the paws on him. Son.
Okay. Okay, that's just a really brief example of what that looks like. Okay, let's go back. There we go. I'm not sure if you were able to see that. I hope so. But because they're speaking a dialect of English, and that's very different than the standard dialect of the school environment that we use. And so it's different with lexicon, it's different, just has different morphology, it has different phonological and syntax and pragmatic, and even those non-verbal features, because sometimes we don't, as Indigenous people, we have like little idiosyncrasies when we speak. So we need to consider Indigenous learners as EAL learners so that we can implement some specific strategies with them. And so they may not speak their own language. They may not be Cree speakers, or they may not be Dene speakers or Michif speakers, but they will speak a dialect of English, and that's important to recognize. Okay. So some of the strategies that you may be able to do is to look at what embedded knowledge that they may have. And that often is the case. And so Aboriginals, EAL learners, this came from Babby's work, probably have pre-existing knowledge in either the dialect of English that they use or the first language that they may speak. And if we're not asking, and they're having trouble with that transference, it may cause problems. So they may need additional help to understand that. And if we're having a monolingual setting and there aren't really very many bilingual dictionaries that may help them, they are also at a disadvantage as well. And so we need to help enhance their linguistic awareness. And when we do that, that helps with those critical and higher order level thinking skills that they need. And also to recognize that there may be more that they know than they're able to speak in standard dialect or in English. And so we get a couple challenges. Without the needed EAL support, what happens is that they need the linguistic background to be able to build on their mainstream classes. And so they have to study or have to have something, some kind of support to do that. Otherwise, they're going to do poorly and they're going to drop out, which statistically tells us is the case. That may not be the case, but now I question whether it might be. And so we need to look at dialects. That's one thing that Life suggested, and that we have 3 challenges if we are not looking at what is our cognitive assessment and our logistic thinking. We may have auditory assessments and associated reading challenges because the language is so different. And then there's also our culturally pedagogical challenges that how students may have learned traditionally may not be the way that we promote in our classrooms. So it does cause all kinds of challenges. So I was going to have you do this as well, but we're going to go through, and this is kind of originally was, can you identify if this is for an EAL learner or an Indigenous learner? And we're going to put them on some lovely Venn diagrams. So the first 2 with our virtual sticky notes. So is the following statement for an Indigenous learner, or is it for an EAL learner? Or is it for both? Does it fall into the category of both? So the first one is they may live in a disadvantaged social economic situation. Is that just for, it's going to be one of those 3 categories. So think about that for a moment. You may have, the learner may have little to no literacy experience in their first language. So is that for an Indigenous learner, for an EAL learner, or is it that middle ground for them? Think about that for a second. The next one, again, we're trying to categorize these, that culture and language are intertwined. So which category or grouping would we put that in? They may speak 1 or more languages or dialects than English. So where would you put that one? And I'll slow down. I do have the tendency to speak quickly sometimes. Okay, the next sticky notes that we are going to try to think about where we would put them. They may have different cultural norms. So is that an EAL one? Is that just an Indigenous learning grouping, or would that be for both? The next sticky note that we would need to categorize says that they may be strong oral learners. So which category would we place those learners in? Okay. Which group of learners would you put the sticky note under that they may have experienced some trauma? And which group would you put that they must learn curriculum content in standard English? So is that EAL? Is that Indigenous learners, or is it both? And our final sticky note that we want to categorize in our heads or thinking as you're going through, you're choosing one of 3, is that are they a visible minority in the classroom? So is that just applied to Indigenous learners? Does that apply to our EAL learners? And does that apply to both? Let's give you a moment for that. Okay. So, as you were thinking, and as we've been talking a little bit, I hope that you realize that all of these categories, that is that sweet spot right in the middle, that they apply both to our Indigenous learners and they apply to our EAL students. So that's where that overlap is coming, and we need to kind of reframe. So in Canada, we know that there's been some progress, slow in the last 30 years of national policies for dealing with EAL learners. And so usually those showed that currently our traditional EAL learners, they tend to do fairly well academically, if not sometimes better. Depends on the group. But for our unsupported EAL learners, the time frame for language development, even if they are being recognized, usually is actually too short for academic success. And so these learners end up dropping out or failing to meet those graduation requirements. So it ends up being very similar to what we see for our students who are older students that come in that are refugees that have come with some trauma as well. All right. Also, in order to support Indigenous learners, one of the biggest problems that actually comes, there's a bit of a conflict of identity. And so historically, those Indigenous learners really have difficulty to maintain their confidence and self-esteem. And this really ends up, especially when everything is so Eurocentric. And so what happens is it clashes with their worldview or what they have as their own personal identity. And so it ends up there in a bit of a paradox, is that they have to, there's a feeling that research has shown with students that feedback is that they have to give up being Indigenous or their Aboriginality in order to be successful in mainstream school. And so what happens is that there's also conflict with parents because parents' experience with school may have been similar. The parents have huge concerns about bias and racism. Many parents don't identify on that their child is Indigenous on their forms because there is a feeling that was, and it was just done by the U of S not too long ago, that if they mark that makes them a target, that right away, if there's some kind of issue, Child Protective Services is going to be called. And that may not be the case, but that is how they interpret that check mark when we self-identify on our school forms. And sometimes there's even a lack really of what EAL is within the for parents. They don't see it. They don't want to see their kids being less than, and yet don't understand the benefits that would happen. Another strategy that can be used is cultural responsive teaching. Now, cultural responsive teaching, if you've done some Indigenous education work, is a slightly different than the EAL definition. And so when we're looking at, obviously, you guys know this, cultural responsive teaching in ELA, this is where we're incorporating students' culture, languages, and experience, and really relating them to classroom learning. Now, in Indigenous education, it's really seeing the incorporation of worldviews and also ways of knowing and using Indigenous pedagogies. So in a way, I think there could be this great overlap again with the Venn diagrams. I did teach math for a really long time, but that creates this sweet spot for learners. And so we just have to know that regardless, either interpretation, I think there's a way to get for learners to be successful and to have their cultures recognized and honored as well. The last place, much of the research also has within that cultural responsive teaching is to know that we have to validate our students' experiences and values, which certainly could happen. We have to disrupt those power dynamics that exist, that privileged dominant groups in classes. Think about that video. We also have to empower our learners. And this is where that idea of voice and choice should be coming in. And so that we become educational partners with our F and learners, and that they feel that they have opportunities for fair and equitable education and that their needs are being met. And sometimes we have not done that. And they may not even realize the need for improved academic language or um, the impact that colonization has had in their learning experience. And so, Indigenous ways of learning and teaching, they don't only look at the intellectual realm, but really that holistic. So, that idea of that we have to talk about the heart and the emotion and the physicality of education. And when we think about how we should teach our EAL learners, we sometimes talk about how that experiential learning that's so important. And that's such a huge Indigenous pedagogy that works out so well. And so we really need to teach the child like the skills and embrace or celebrate their own individual values and attitudes and even knowledge moving forward. Another big
Well,
part.
I'm going to rush you a little bit,
Yep.
just
Yep.
about
Yep.
5 minute warning here.
Yeah, yeah, I have one too. So we also use explicit instructions. And so that idea of using maybe not academic language so much, but like that interpersonal language, but they really do need some academic language and looking at traditional ways of teaching as well. So I am going to skip ahead a little bit because I do want to have some time. That idea I already talked about of learner agency, having choice and voice, and students and teachers knowing and innovating alongside their students and giving them voice, that creates that equity piece. That's really, really important. Okay, so why does all of this matter? So 11% of the Aboriginal population in Canada actually lived in Saskatchewan in 2011, and they make up 16% of our total population. And of that population, over half are under the age of 25. And that is huge compared to the non-Aboriginal population. And so when we start looking at timelines and who's graduating on time, we're looking at right now that our Aboriginal learners are only graduating like 44.7% of the time on time graduation records compared to our non-Indigenous learners. I'm totally okay sharing our stats. We just looked at them. And so we were celebrating the fact here at the Northeast School Division that we have 65% of our Indigenous learners graduating on time. And before we started patting ourselves on the back, we started looking at compared to our non-Aboriginal students, our non-Aboriginal students actually have a 98.7%. So we need to change these dynamics. And I'm hoping one of the ways is to change how we view Aboriginal learners and treat them more like EAL learners. And I apologize for rushing. But there's some great resources available, and I think there should be on your handout. If you're interested in seeing initial assessments, the Prince Albert Catholic School developed one a number of years ago. It's actually a great resource to look at and to identify those learners that just might need that little bit of extra help. The book by Joe Crona, Waiwa, is really good about learning about different pedagogies that can help support these learners, as well as there's a number of different ones about videos by Kevin Lamoureux about decolonization in your classrooms and recognizing how you can change your narratives in your classroom. Not just, and this does not just apply for Indigenous learners, but all EAL learners. So a couple other ones. If you're wondering about your own personal bias, there's a Harvard implicit bias survey that can really help point that out. So I'm going to wrap up there because I did want to see if there was any questions. And again, I apologize for rushing.